Hi, I'm Katrina, and this is Boldly Challenging Ableism. I'm your host, Katrina Simons. I'm the Community Program Specialist at the Institute on Community Integration at the University of Minnesota. This program explores various topics that impact people with disabilities in our community. Each episode addresses a different aspect of our society within the context of ableism. Ableism is the prejudice that stems from the belief or belief system that assumes someone is less capable or less worthy because of a real or perceived difference in ability or function. On this program, we hope to answer some questions you may have been afraid to ask, or maybe some you didn't even know you had. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hi, everybody. In this episode, we talked to Brian Bajan about employment services for people with disabilities. When we recorded this episode, Brian worked here at ICI, but he recently moved on to be the Director of Day and Employment Services at LifeWorks, which is a local provider agency here in the Twin Cities. We wish him the best. Enjoy the conversation. Thanks for coming, Brian.
Thank you so much, Katrina. I'm very excited to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I work at the Institute on Community Integration at the University of Minnesota. I'm an education program specialist. I've been here for 2 years. Before that, I spent 9.5 years working for a nonprofit, LifeWorks Services, and they provide employment and day services to adults and transition-age youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they primarily operate in the 7-county metro area.
Can you just tell us a little bit, a sentence or two, on what day services are?
Yeah, so day services are home and community-based services that are funded by a waiver, and they support folks to be meaningfully engaged in their community without emphasis on employment, so non-employment services.
And just so people know, we haven't talked about a waiver yet as of this episode, but a waiver is an amount of money given to an individual by the state that is designated to be used to support their disability-related needs. So some people have waivers that cover where they live, and some people have waivers that cover where they work, and some people have waivers that cover staff to come and support them. But everybody is different, and the waiver can be used in a lot of different ways. Why did you choose to work in the disability support sector?
Well, I've always been an outgoing person. I like talking to people, and since high school, I realized I wanted to do work that made a difference in my community, and I wasn't really sure what that looked like. But so wanting to make a difference, liking talking to people, interacting with people, I put those two things together, and that led me to human services. I started off working in a nursing home. And then from there, after about 12 years, progressed into working with adults and transition-age youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I've had the opportunity to do different types of work in the human services sector, which I've really appreciated. And the last 12 years now has really been focused on helping people with IDD find and keep jobs in the community.
All right. And again, IDD is people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And generally, those are disabilities that have onset before the age of 22, significant impairments, and they're permanent. So that's kind of how the federal government defines IDD. You're here today to talk to us about 14C. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Start with what it is.
Yeah. Since 1938, Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act, that's a federal act, has authorized employers, after receiving a certificate, which is called a 14C special wage certificate, to pay wages that are less than the federal minimum wage to workers who have disabilities. This is authorized through the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, and it's pretty controversial. There's only 2 groups of people in the United States that can be paid less than the minimum wage legally. That's people who are incarcerated and people with disabilities. So according to the Wage and Hour Division, this is data up to date as of November 1st. There were 711 employers across the 50 states in the District of Columbia that held a 14C special wage certificate. Basically, are legally allowed to pay people with disabilities less than the minimum wage. And across the United States, there's currently about 37,000 people with disabilities earning below the minimum wage. It's legal in 37 states. So there are some states that have 14 states that have actually passed legislation prohibiting this rather. So the federal government says, yes, you can do this, but at the state level, they say, no, we don't believe in this practice. We don't want to do it. And in Minnesota, it's allowed to pay folks less than minimum wage. And there are 51 organizations in Minnesota that do that, and there's about 3,100 people with disabilities earning less than a minimum wage.
Wow. What might a day look like for a person when they worked in a congregate or non-competitive setting, like a setting where they're getting paid that sub-minimum wage that you were talking about in the last question?
Yeah, so sometimes this work is done in a building that's owned and operated by a service provider. The language of the Fair Labor Standards Act says employers, but like 91% of folks that hold these special wage certificates are service providers that specifically serve people with IDD, right? And so oftentimes they own a building, and folks who receive services come to that building and they work in what's called a sheltered workshop, because it's a room where they're the only people without disabilities that these folks are interacting with are paid staff. Otherwise, it's themselves and other people with disabilities. We call this a legacy model of services. There was a time when this was a cutting-edge service, and it's just not that anymore, and it hasn't been that way for a while. And folks are typically served for about 6 hours, and part of their day they'll be in these sheltered workshops doing what we call piece rate work.
And can you just talk a little bit about what piece rate work is?
Well, you and I get paid an hourly rate, and we get done what we have to get done, what we can get done. Piece rate work is where a person gets paid for each individual piece of work they do. So every widget they put together, or every
flower they put on a barrette.
Exactly. Yeah, and the number of those that they do determines how much they make. So some folks might get paid as little as $1 an hour.
Oh my gosh, that is not very much money. So some people might say, yes, they're getting paid less per hour, but all their needs are taken care of. How might you respond to that?
Well, we want services to be more than just meeting a person's basic needs. In fact, services typically require specific outcomes that are based on what the person wants. And so we think many folks that work in human services, and most folks with IDD, think that they can find jobs in the community with the right supports and services. And so we don't want to see people just getting by. We want to see people thriving, taking pride in their work, getting new experiences, earning a fair wage, having opportunities to explore new kinds of work that might be a better fit for them.
Well, and when I hear $1 an hour, that just makes me think about people's dignity and how nobody else that doesn't have a disability would ever have to stand for that. And if we just assume that people with disabilities can make as little as $1 an hour, what else are we assuming about them?
Yeah, that's a really great point, Katrina. I think that what I've seen in over the course of my career is society's low expectations for folks with disabilities, and that often stems from just a misunderstanding of what services and supports can look like. Some folks who support the ability of people with disabilities to make less than minimum wage will say, well, hey, they're happy if you ask them. my argument and many other folks' arguments is like, well, if you only know this one thing, if you haven't had the opportunity to try different work to make a competitive wage, you don't really have a frame of reference. So it's not really fair to say, hey, do you like apples when the only fruit you've ever had is apples? That's just not really a fair question.
Sometimes when I try to think about all the ways that disability can impact someone's life and disability can impact the lives of the people around them, I like to think of it in terms of choice and how much choice can we give someone without taking away, assuming that everybody deserves the same degree of choice in their life, which even if we assume that's true, we know people don't get it. Even two able-bodied people don't get it. So I think what you're getting at there is if we don't give someone choice, then they won't know how to make it, which I feel like comes up a lot when we talk about supporting people with disabilities.
Yeah, that's very well said. Person-centered thinking and planning, empowering folks to have self-determination, so to be able to decide what they want in their lives. And sadly, folks with disabilities often don't get that chance, sort of under the guise of protection. We have to protect these folks from being harmed, being exploited. Sure, we all need protection. I mean, it's a big, scary world out there, but I don't think the answer is like, let's just have you work in a building that is totally walled off from the community.
Yeah, I think you're right. Can you tell us what a day might look like when someone who used to work in a sheltered workshop, when they transition to community-based employment with a competitive wage?
They go to work like all of us. They go and they clock in and they work with people who might have disabilities. They work with people who might not have disabilities. They check in with their supervisor at the beginning of the shift and get some direction on what they're supposed to be doing for the day. They have opportunities to earn vacation time, to qualify for benefits. They get to do all the fun stuff that you and I get to do, like participate in company potlucks and maybe go on outings with the company and whatnot. And they get to be a part of their community. They also have the opportunity to apply for different jobs, get promotions. Those are things that folks don't get when they're working in a sheltered workshop.
Can you give us like one example of, you don't have to give us the person's name, but like of a person who you know that they work in a community-based setting? What does that one person's day look like?
I've worked with a lot of folks that work in competitive integrated employment, and they'll usually utilize some form of public transportation to get to work, like Metro Mobility. And so a lot of folks have like a job coach that'll help them set up their rides or help them figure out how they're going to get to and from work. And then they'll utilize public transportation or walk. Some folks drive, they will have a job coach that will check in on them. It could be once a week. It could be once per shift. It's totally individualized. Everybody has different support needs in that regard.
And where might they work? What types of places might they work?
Sure. So I know folks that work at Cargill, that work at Ecolab. Those are some big companies here in Minnesota. I know folks that work at Lunds & Byerly's. I know folks that work at mom and pop shops like flower shops. We had a person that worked at a family-run dog kennel, like a dog grooming and boarding business. Folks work for landscaping companies. I mean, you name it. There are any job that you can think of, there's most likely a person with a disability that's working that job.
Thank you. You also work on RISP. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so RISP stands for the Residential Information Systems Project. Since 1977, RISP has gathered, maintained, and analyzed longitudinal data on Medicaid long-term supports and services for people with IDD. So RISP is a longitudinal data project of national significance. It's funded by the Administration on Community Living, so it's federally funded. And every year, RISP distributes a survey to the 50 states and the District of Columbia, and we gather information at the state level about folks with disabilities, where they're living. Are they in their own home? Do they live in group homes? Do they live in institutions? How many people live in what setting? What kind of funding is available for services, and how many people want services but are currently waiting to get those. And we put out a really cool report once a year on all of this data. And it's really important. RISP's purpose, original purpose, was to document where people lived with an eye towards supporting the movement for people to receive services in their home and in the community. So getting away from deinstitutionalization.
From institutionalization, right?
Institutionalization,
okay,
correct.
Because we want to deinstitutionalize people.
Yeah, right. So RISP was helping with the deinstitutionalization movement by gathering data that we could present to policymakers so they could actually see some numbers. Wow, this many people live in institutions, or hey, we're actually making progress year over year. More people are moving out into the community.
Okay, can you share with us who pays for RISP?
It's a federally funded grant, so the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has a sub-department called the Administration on Community Living, and every 5 years here at ICI we have to submit a grant proposal, and we're fortunate we've gotten awarded that grant since 1977 to do this important work.
Wow, we get every time since 1977?
Yes.
Wow, we're really doing a good job.
You know, I work with some really intelligent people. The project officer, Dr. Sherry Larson, has been a part of this project since the 80s, and yeah, she does great work, and I'm so fortunate to get to contribute to it.
Go Sherry.
Go Sherry.
There's a common thread in your work of all of your work kind of stems back to the deinstitutionalization movement. How do you think we're doing on that?
My work centers around supporting people with IDD to be of their community through employment and in other meaningful ways, such as volunteering, social clubs, things like that. And as you said, Katrina, that all started with the deinstitutionalization movement. I think we have made some progress, and so
I do have to stop you because I didn't say what the deinstitutionalization movement was. The deinstitutionalization movement kind of started in the 70s, and it was to move people with disabilities and other people who needed supports living out of like large congregate settings. We want smaller settings, and we want people living on their own if they can. Okay, sorry. I should have done that first. I apologize.
I appreciate the context. So fortunately, because of projects such as RISP and other important research projects that are going on across the U.S., we do have some data year over year so we can track our progress. So in 1977, 84% of people with IDD that were not living with a family member lived in a setting of 16 or more people. This isn't like, oh, cool, I'm living with my two best friends in a 3-bedroom apartment. No, this is an institution, and they were horrible.
Right. And just for context, we know with pretty good certainty that the larger the institution, the higher the likelihood that the care is not good.
We have that well documented, yes.
So 16 people or more isn't great.
No. And that was the norm in 1977. 84%, right? Now, in 2020, 84% of people with IDD that did not live with a family member lived in a setting with 1 to 6 people. So that's like your smaller group homes that are in the community. And so that's one data point that I think is really powerful about showing progress. I've got a few others, if I may, related to employment. So beginning in 1990 with the state of Pennsylvania, 39 states have an official employment first policy based on legislation or a policy directive. So what that means is that in 39 states, competitive integrated employment is the first option for services. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, was signed into law in 2014, and among other provisions contains a federal employment first policy. So federally, we say here in the United States that competitive integrated employment should be the first option for folks with IDD. So the impact of employment first policies is that more people with IDD are working in competitive jobs in their communities than ever before. That said, we have a lot of work to do. There are still big disparities in the levels of employment for people with disabilities versus people without disabilities. I also track progress or think about progress in terms of legislation to tackle segregation, right? And to make the world that we live in, society, more equitable and accessible for everybody. And since the 1960s, there's been some very important landmark legislation that has passed, like the DD Act, the Rehabilitation Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Olmstead Supreme Court decision in 1999. I just threw a few things out that I would encourage our listeners to do a little research on their own and look those up. But those were all pieces of legislation that were hard fought to get passed, and it was folks with lived experiences that were really making their voices heard and forming allyships that got that done. And we've still got more work to do, but we're making progress.
How do you feel about the rate of change? Do you feel like things are changing too fast, too slow?
I guess historically speaking, things are changing fast. So I never worked in an institution. However, some of my colleagues actually worked in institutions. So some of the people that I provided services to actually started receiving services in institutions. So it wasn't that long ago that was a reality for a lot of folks with disabilities. And when I think about it like that, I'm like, wow, things have really changed. I mean, I know folks that within their lifetime went from living in an institution to living in a home of their own independently.
Yeah. Did you know Cliff Potes? He passed away in March of 21, but he used to work here, and that was his story. He lived with cerebral palsy, and he was diagnosed with an intellectual disability, but then it turned out later that he didn't actually have one. It was just sort of assumed back then. But he was 70 when he passed away, and he started in his family home, and then he moved out into an institution, and then he moved into like a congregate living setting with a little bit more freedom, and then he eventually moved into his own home.
So unfortunately, I never had the pleasure of meeting Cliff in person, but gosh, working here at ICI, I've heard a lot about him.
He's kind of legendary.
I would say so. And that's a very impactful story. And so you think about the life of one person and all of the changes, I would say that's progress. And we have more work to do.
Yeah, I would say both of those things, but I would also say that it feels very slow when you're in it. But then if you zoom out, it gets faster.
Yeah.
That's kind of
I would agree with that.
What do you tell legislators to help move this movement forward?
So many legislators at the state and federal level don't know a person with a disability, and they've never worked in human services. So telling our stories is one of the most effective ways we can influence public policy. And the most impactful stories are from people with lived experiences. So people like Cliff talking to elected officials, and I know that he did that plenty.
He was very passionate about advocacy and using advocacy to help people.
Those are the things that are going to open the eyes and the minds and the hearts of elected officials to be open to change. I would consider myself somewhat of a subject matter expert, and so I can meet with them too and provide some of more of like the nitty-gritty data and whatnot, though sometimes those stories I don't know, aren't as fun.
Right. Careful, you might get some emails.
Yeah, right. But when I meet with elected officials, I remind them that while much progress has been made through legislation, there's still work to do. We still have institutions, and there are still states, including Minnesota, where people with disabilities can earn below the minimum wage. So when you're talking with elected officials, highlight the progress, but then also point out where we still have work to do. And then if we can provide research to elected officials saying, showing like, hey, here are outcomes that lead to, folks working in the community, living independently, living their best lives, being happy with services. That it can tell a powerful story as well. And voting is so important. So when we go to the polls, we all must educate ourselves and figure out this elected official that I'm voting for, where do they stand on issues related to services and supports for people with disabilities? And sometimes they don't have a stance at all, so then that's when we meet with them and we educate them.
What is one thing that you think would surprise people that are unfamiliar with the disability community about people with disabilities working or living in their own community?
I think folks would be surprised that people with disabilities can legally be paid less than the minimum wage in Minnesota. And I also think folks would be surprised at how many people there are around them that have disabilities that are working and living and thriving in their communities, and folks don't even know they have a disability.
Thank you so much, Brian. This has been a real treat.
Thank you so much, Katrina. My pleasure.
And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We hope you'll come back next time.
Boldly Challenging Ableism is a co-production of AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and the Institute on Community Integration at the University of Minnesota. For more information, please visit ici.umn.edu.